This is Terry Beatley, your host of What If We've Been Wrong? I'm shining light into some dark places so that beauty, goodness, and truth defeat the schemes of the enemy. It's true, people are perishing for lack of knowledge, and we're instructed to have nothing to do with the evil deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. That's what I do on What If We've Been Wrong? Rethink, explore, and uncover some hidden truths so that more people can experience an abundant life and the joy of being set free from the shackles that hold us in prison. Welcome to What If We've Been Wrong? If you haven't been looking at the news, then you haven't picked up on the fact that the people on the left, are trying to do away with the Electoral College. If you missed the news from a couple months ago, we know that the governor of Virginia is for infanticide, and we know Governor Cuomo up in New York, he just completely passed and so bravely and joyfully passed unfettered abortion law in the name of women's reproductive rights up in New York. And we have all sorts of attacks going on in America. Look at what they're doing to our children in the government-run school. They're turning our children into one-world government thinkers. We're being attacked left side, right side, frontal assault, and backside, which is why I invited Delegate Bob Marshall from Virginia. He served in the House of Delegates for, I think it was like 26 years. He's recently published a book called Reclaiming the Republic. Delegate Marshall, thanks for being on the show today.
Well, thank you, Terry, for having me. Right. The book is Reclaiming the Republic, and Tan Books out of North Carolina has published it.
That's right, Tan Book. Well, you wrote it, and Tan Books published it, and it is packed full of information.
Right.
So let's just hop right on this thing. Let me kind of throw a wide question, Bob. What's at stake if we don't pull back on losing our country to, as far as I'm concerned, it's Marxism. Maybe you got a different spin on this, but if we don't take this back from people who want to destroy our country, our liberty, our Constitution, what's at stake?
Let me just say this to you. Christ told his followers to be the salt of the earth. That's a metaphor for being the preservative of society. Salt was a preservative, still is a preservative. And if the Christians aren't doing this, what replaces that? Christ told us it was the leaven of the Pharisees. They're the ones who will animate and vivify for their own purposes the body politic. And that's very dangerous for people marked with the sign of faith.
Right. Well, and so what would you say, what kind of tactics, and you have 20 plus years experience at this, what tactics do progressive use to intimidate Christians from, say, civic involvement? What do? How do they undermine Christians?
Well, they first of all claim that anybody who differs with them in the slightest is a bigot, a moral malefactor, a social outcast, someone who really doesn't deserve answers. So they kind of vilify you. That's the first thing. Mm-hmm. Secondly, is when they lose an election, they don't quit there. They either say the election was fraudulent, like with this effort with Trump and Hillary for the last 2 years, or they want to change the entire mechanism of the election, hence the effort to get rid of the Electoral College. So they don't stop. They just switch tactics. Their goals of domination remain the same. Now, if you think about this, the book of Hosea said, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." It didn't say lack of enthusiasm. It says lack of knowledge. If that's the case, the antidote to that is to gain knowledge of Caesar's world. And you say, well, my goal is heaven. That's correct. But you get there by what you do or don't do to your brother on this earth. And again, Christ told us to render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. What's the immediate implication of that? Any individual or group of individuals who seek total, absolute control over their fellow citizens is a dictator, is a totalitarian. They are violating that injunction, which basically states, look, there's a proper role for Caesar on earth, and there's a proper role for God on earth.
Right.
And both claim allegiance, and both are valid authorities. But if Caesar wants everything, there is no rendering, to the Lord. There's only rendering to Caesar. So Christians cannot be complacent with or collaborate with or facilitate the erection of a total state government. And I don't mean just state, meaning like Virginia or, Oregon or whatever, meaning the civil order cannot belong totally to Caesar. And in salvation history, if you think about this at all, the Lord used individuals who knew the kind of how the ropes work with the power of the government where they were living. For example, Joseph, the coat of many colors. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, but he became the second in command in Egypt. Now, God, in effect, placed him in a position to save the chosen people from starvation. Why? Because he knew how Caesar's government worked. He operated. He was like, just like I say, right after the Pharaoh, he was in charge. That was number one. Number two, Moses was raised in the courts of Pharaoh by Pharaoh's daughter. He knew how the Pharaoh's government worked. He could talk to Pharaoh. He knew how to, get into the to the temple, into the presence of Pharaoh. And without that, how could the request of the Lord have come to the ear of the head of the government? It wouldn't. You had to have somebody who knew how the government worked. Thirdly, St. Paul was in a fight with the Sanhedrin, which was, I guess, the equivalent of the Jewish Senate for Israel. Paul wanted to preach Christ crucified. The Sanhedrin went to the Roman governor, Festus, and they wanted to have him turn Paul over to them because they wanted to put a gag rule on him and not allow Paul to preach Christ crucified. Festus, if you remember the book of the Acts, he seemed ready to turn Paul over for whatever reason,
right,
to the Sanhedrin. What did Paul do? He said, "You can't do that to me." Oh, why? Why can't I do it to you? I'm the Roman governor here. Paul said, "Because I am a Roman citizen." This must have, hit Festus like a, whack in the head with a 4x4. He, in effect, was about to turn over a Roman citizen to someone whom Caesar thought to be a subordinate power. I mean, this would have cost him, it's not his head, then his job. So he could not, consistent with the rules of the Roman Empire, how the government operated, turn a Roman citizen over to a conquered people for adjudication, for, dismissal or evaluation or handling in any way he wanted. So Festus said, "You appeal to Caesar, you're going to Rome." This was in a religious rights, free speech situation. This wasn't over a contract. This was over religious rights, the ability of Paul to preach Christ crucified.
Right.
If the Lord used these three people, and he did use them, in part, he picked them because they, number one, they had faith, but number two, they also had a necessary condition for defending the faith. It was the knowledge of Caesar's world. These examples should teach us that we have a requirement to know about Caesar's world, to defend the truths of the faith, or even just to live in peace and practice your faith without being harassed.
Right.
So if you don't do any of this, you are asking for trouble.
Well, and now with that, about asking for trouble, I think so much of the trouble begins with people don't even understand the value system for which America was founded upon, which is the Christian Judeo value system, completely embedded in the Declaration of Independence. What I tell, people is that we have nothing to apologize for. That Declaration of Independence is not a Sharia document. It's not an atheist-based kind of document. It's the value system is based on. But it swings back to this, the laws of nature and nature's God. That's written in there. But Americans today, Delegate, they don't even understand what that means. So can you explain what did he mean when Thomas Jefferson wrote the laws of nature and nature's God? What do we mean?
This is really interesting. People often associate natural law only with Catholics or Roman Catholics. That is not accurate. And it's certainly not accurate because among the, 55 people who signed the Declaration of Independence, only one was a Roman Catholic, whose name is Charles Carroll of Carrollton. He was probably the richest man in the entire, colonial time. So natural law was the simple understanding of the rules of right and wrong writ in nature, where, St. Paul refers to this, that the pagans do by nature what, some of you are being required to do by faith. So if they do by nature what you do by faith, there's a congruence here.
Right.
The fact is, stealing is wrong. Why? Because it wasn't your property. If it wasn't your property, how do you propose to dispose of it? So these laws are written in nature. It's the book of nature. And whether you're Muhammad, whether you're an atheist, all things fall down. They don't fall up. And thou shalt not kill applies across the board. So these things do not require faith. These moral precepts do not require faith. They're assisted by faith. They're refined by faith. They're implemented better if you do have the gift of faith, but they don't necessarily need faith for you to proceed that way. You need faith to be habitually virtuous. You don't need faith to be virtuous in one individual act. But we have totally forgotten that.
Right.
And when you veered so far from nature, you now have people, guys, who think they're women. I mean, you cannot change your DNA. That doesn't happen. It's a fantasy. But to see what that says, in nature, in the natural order, there are fixed rules. There are fixed, not just guidelines, there are fixed orders of being that you cannot transcend. Well, the transgender people, they claim they can do that. So there really aren't any laws of nature or nature's God. It's a whim. It's a God who was, maybe absent-minded or whatever, but certainly there are no rules, permanent ones, that everybody has to keep at all places, at all times, and at all nations. So you see, when you got at least half the Democratic Party thinking men can become women or vice versa, how far we have come.
Right.
So what I did in my book, the first chapter after the introduction, is I discuss the laws of nature and nature's God, because that was the standard by which the founders of the country pointed to, asked the world to judge them about their actions, the laws of nature and nature's God.
All right, so let's segue then over to, let's look at chapter 1 again, religious liberty. So what's the origin of the term religious liberty, and how it's affirmed in the First Amendment? How would you explain that one?
Well, religare is a Latin word meaning to bind, and liberty is kind of part of what you are when you have free will. So the founders did not want to have a country where you were compelled to be a certain denomination. You were granted religious liberty. Now, this is interesting. At the national level, nobody could be required to belong to any particular religious denomination, because it says you can't require anybody to profess an oath, for a certain religion for federal office. At the state level, there were requirements that you belong to certain Christian sects, that you profess belief in the Trinity. But for the national government, there was no religious test that could be given to say, like, well, if you're Episcopal, you can't, do that in, Rhode Island, or you can't be a congressman from Rhode Island. There was no religious test for office in the federal government, but we have seen religious tests being imposed by United States senators. First of all, in the instance of this Amy Coney Barrett, who was a law professor at Notre Dame and was appointed as an appellate court judge in one of the districts in the middle of the United States. Dianne Feinstein, when she was grilling Ms. Barrett, said, the dogma comes through to you. And what she was going after her for was her position, obviously, on abortion. Mm-hmm. And then you had this other judge. I think he was for the D.C. Court of Appeals. I can't think of his name right now. Mm-hmm. But that senator from Hawaii, that lady who told all the men in the country to sit down and shut up, she basically said, "You belong to the Knights of Columbus."
Right.
That's a hate group. That's a bigot group. How do you reach that point where a group that helps disabled children is a hate group or bigot group? I think the hate may be more endemic to the U.S. senator projecting her animosity onto this judge. So the position of Christians in this society has taken about 15 steps back. And it's not necessarily because of the aggressiveness of the seculars. It's because of the pulling back of the Christians. You can't have this. For example, let me give you an example. Go on.
No, I just want to say, I don't think Christians know how to, for lack of a better word, argue. The Christian apologetics. They don't know how. And then I think, too, there's this fear element. They're afraid to. They're afraid they may offend somebody, and they don't understand that if we can't stand on our own Christian faith and be able to defend it, the enemy reigns. And that's, in my mind, that's what we're dealing with. I think it's more of a lack of confidence or ability because they haven't been trained properly.
Well, that's in part why I wrote the book.
I know. That's why I want everybody to get your book.
The knowledge of the natural law, right. the civic order. Let me give you an example. There's roughly 88,000 precincts in the entire United States. In Virginia, there's 2,578 or 67. Anyway, how many of those precincts? A precinct is the smallest division of the body politic. It's a place where everybody goes to vote on a certain day of the year. It's bound by boundary lines. The characteristics of a precinct are that you have to have so many people to be able to get through the polling day within in Virginia it's 13 hours. It goes from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. Other states it goes from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. at night. So a precinct is the place where you live, where you actually have the most influence because it's closest to you, and it's how Caesar's world is organized. So if you're going to do anything, you got to conform to the way Caesar's world is structured. So that's the first thing that you look at. You need to know what are the boundary lines of your precinct. But again, there's 187,000 precincts, 188,000. How many are run by dedicated, intelligent, shrewd Christians? I wouldn't even begin to hazard a guess. But given what I see in the composition of Congress, it's got to be clearly less than half.
And with that, we're going to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere, and we're going to be coming right back with Delegate Bob Marshall. We're going to be digging deeper into his book, Reclaiming the Republic.
The goal is to deliver a message of truth, inspiration, and hope to the world, to unite people from all backgrounds and beliefs in an effort to advance humanity. News blogs, informative podcasts, and entertaining videos. It's AmericaOutloud.com, where the conversation never ends, with 24/7 streaming on our free apps on both Android and Apple. Welcome to the new era in communications, America Out Loud Talk Radio.
All right, you're back with Terry Beatley and Delegate Bob Marshall. He's written a book called Reclaiming the Republic. You can get that book on Amazon. I highly encourage you to get that book. You probably won't find a better book. Delegate Marshall, he knows how to write. And he writes well, and he writes so that everybody can understand this kind of content. So, Delegate, we're going to shift over here talking about the rolling back rule by judges. That's chapter 2 in your book. What did delegates in the 1787 Philadelphia Constitutional Convention think of the role of judges in the national government, especially regarding the establishment of public policy? What did they think?
Absolutely zero. They should have no role in establishing policy. They were to implement the policy that the legislature devised based on the representation to an electorate that largely held the natural law ethic to be the kind of the arbitration lines between people. So the courts were not supposed to devise on their own or fill in the cracks where they thought there was something missing in the Constitution. For example, if you look at Article 3 of the Constitution, you see that there's something called jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is the authority that a court has to hear a case and to render a decision, pro and con, and then it gets appealed up. The U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land in the civil order, and the state judges and federal judges are all to be bound by that. Mm-hmm. But there is a provision in there where Congress can control the type of case that goes from the state Supreme Court to a federal court.
Could they have stopped Roe v. Wade? Could they have stopped Roe v. Wade from?
Correct.
Could they? Okay.
Yes. I put in my book an example. This is kind of later on, but I put in my book an example of a statute introduced by a congressman from Indiana named Hofstadter. And this was like in the early 2000s. It was floor managed by a congressman from Wisconsin named Sensenbrenner, who was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. But anyway, Hofstadter put this bill in, and it harkened back to a law that Bill Clinton, of all people, signed, which Congress passed, which was called the Defense of Marriage Act. And what that said was that, say, Virginia did not have to accept a law from Hawaii which said that two guys can get married. In other words, you're supposed to have reciprocity between the states, except if Congress doesn't want it there. So when this started in the mid-'90s, Virginia actually passed a statute, we're not going to recognize out-of-state marriages between two men. I amended that, and I successfully amended that to say we're not going to recognize out-of-state civil unions, from between people of the same sex. Well, anyway, the homosexual lobby was very shrewd, and they were trying to use the mechanism of the Constitution to leverage their drive for so-called marriage. It's not marriage, but it's so-called marriage. Anyway, mm-hmm. The people in the Congress started to pass a statute, I think it was 2004, which said that no federal court can hear a challenge to the law that Congress passed that allowed states to decline to recognize out-of-state same-sex marriages or same-sex civil unions. It passed the House, mm-hmm. and I actually point there that the Library of Congress gave bum advice to members of Congress in saying that you couldn't do this, and the lawyer who worked for Sensenbrenner is a friend of mine. His name is Phil Kiko. He basically wrote to the Library of Congress and pointed out where they, in fact, had acknowledged that courts can have their jurisdiction curbed. Mm-hmm. And this passed the House of Representatives, and it went to the Senate. The Senate was run by Republicans at that time. You had George Bush as president. Unfortunately, the Republican senators did not take this bill up. Had they taken it up, and had it been presented to George Bush, who hopefully would have signed it, the Obergefell decision, which came down in 2015, could never have been rendered because there could not be in a federal court a challenge from a state law limiting marriage to one man, one woman,
right,
or a civil union, and there was not allowing for civil unions. It could not have gotten into a federal court to strike that down and every other one. Mm-hmm. So this is where the Republicans totally, by their whimpery, by their timidity, right, by their not wanting to face these things, have put us in a box.
Oh, yeah.
Now, you can still do this. I mean, mm-hmm. you can still do this to say you can't take these cases up and then we start passing these things all over again. But had that been done prior to this, the abortion people were kind of proceeding, pretty rapidly. the abortion reform so-called laws started passing in the 1960s, mid-1960s, where they basically took a life of the mother exception clause. Although Virginia's was interesting, they had a law that says you can't have an abortion except to save the life of the mother or the child. So abortion didn't mean the killing of the baby, it meant removing the baby from the mother.
Right.
But anyway, had that happened, the Supreme Court could not have struck down all these laws. Now let me tell you how powerful or how complete the authority is on this thing. After the Civil War, the South was occupied by armies, and there were military, governors running states, basically. And there was a fight in Mississippi between an editor of a paper and the Union General down there. And the editor wanted to print certain things, I think critical of Lincoln, and the Union General said, no, you're not going to do it. So the editor went ahead to kind of push a test case. This test case went all the way up and was heard in the U.S. Supreme Court in the late 1860s. And then the Supreme Court adjourned for summer recess, but they heard the arguments, pro and con. The lawyers came there and made their points, and then they left. In between the time when the court adjourned and the court reconvened, the radical Republicans in Congress passed a statute which said there was no jurisdiction to hear appeals on cases like this. It passed, became law. So when the Supreme Court reconvened, later, I guess in the fall, they were going to render a decision on this. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court said, basically, this was called ex parte McCardle, said, well, in the meantime, the ability of the court to hear this case has been removed from our jurisdiction, so we can't hear any appeals like this. Case dismissed. Now, mind you, this is having to do with a right under the First Amendment, and a newspaper editor wanting to print an editorial, and being run by a union general for military government, and the Supreme Court, which was God knows it was the configuration of it. They said we can't render a decision because our jurisdiction is gone, which means that the Congress can yank the jurisdiction today if they wanted to shove all these cases back into the states. Now, it doesn't end the abortion fight.
Oh, go ahead. It doesn't end the abortion fight.
But it repositions it. It does revive, in effect, the old statutes in a number of states which were never repealed. So if Roe is reversed, then laws in a number of states automatically go back into effect. There's probably maybe 12 or 14.
Right.
The rest of the states would have to pass statutes all over again.
Okay.
And there's no doubt in my mind that Planned Parenthood would try to invalidate those laws that are currently on the books, but can't be enforced.
Right. Well, you may have already answered the question then. So does the Constitution give the Supreme Court a right to be the final arbiter and interpreter of the Constitution? Walk us through that in summation, not lengthy, but just summation.
The answer in one word is no. Now, I'm not citing Bob Marshall in that. I'm citing John Roberts. The John Roberts, who was an assistant attorney general under Ronald Reagan in the Justice Department, who now is the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. All that's required for due process is that you have your case heard somewhere in some court. It doesn't say a federal court. There's no due process right to have a case heard in the U.S. Supreme Court. There's only a due process right that you have it heard somewhere, but it doesn't have to be heard in the U.S. Supreme Court. Moreover, all presidents take an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. All members of Congress take an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. All state legislators take oaths to uphold and defend the Constitution. When you go into the military, you take an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. The Supreme Court does not have the exclusive right to be the final arbiter. But they are the final arbiter if Congress doesn't take the jurisdiction away. This is where you need to get into a fight on this thing. Now, this is maybe arcane knowledge. It shouldn't be. Yep.
Well,
Go on.
what about tolerance? We keep hearing this word. We have to be tolerant. Tolerant. Does the Constitution say anything about that we have to be tolerant?
Actually, only the Declaration of Independence says that mankind are more disposed to endure certain ills, when they can be tolerated. But there becomes a point where you can't do it. Toleration is a term from physics where it applies to movement beyond one side of a mean or the other. In other words, a steel beam or a wooden beam has certain flexibility in it. Not a lot, but there's some there. The beam can operate as a support for a bridge as long as you don't exceed the tolerance. When you exceed the tolerance, the beam breaks, the bridge falls down.
Right.
Tolerance implies necessarily a standard from which you can only slightly deviate and still keep the entire structure working. Tolerate doesn't mean anything goes. The other side uses that. Well, you have to tolerate, these kinds of behaviors. No, you don't.
Right.
You hate the sin, love the sinner, but you don't have to tolerate any kind of behavior. I mean, no civil government could operate that way.
Okay, I think it'd be a good spot to just have you explain, just in case someone's listening to this and they've been maybe confused about why we as Christians fight so hard to preserve God-ordained marriage. Explain the why behind it, Delegate. I can't think of anyone who's probably more articulate about this. What happens? Well, we've already done it. I mean, it's already been at least temporarily destroyed. But why defend it? Why not just embrace 2 men, 2 women, go get married? What happens to a culture?
First of all, in the order of nature, a child is not possible from whatever union can be, contrived between 2 people of the same sex. It's physiologically impossible. Mm-hmm. Can't happen. The order of nature requires a man and a woman, and the dependency of the child requires a union between the parents to protect the interest of that child. It's not one that can be satisfied, just with, sexual relations up front, because the human being takes a long time to mature. That necessitates a bond between the mother and the father that is not breakable. So when you pretend that 2 men can get married, it's interesting. When you look at the Obergefell decision, there's no definition of marriage.
Right.
They just say two men can do it, or 2 women, whatever. Alternately, they talk about, entering into this, but they don't limit it to 2 people. So all you have to do is look at the Obergefell decision and say 3 people can constitute a marriage. God knows what that would, be, but that is it's because the basis of society depends upon the protection of human life, the preservation of nascent human life, the training of young human life requires these things for the benefit of the individual and the benefit of the parents. And the third benefit is all of society. You can't have something called marriage that's between a man and a man. I mean, you could have friendships, but you don't have any carnal relationships that constitute marriage between persons of the same sex. Mm-hmm. So that's why it is the origin of all the rights, because it's the origin of the individual human in the created order that must be preserved, that must be defended, it must be reflected in the civil laws. And when you don't have that, you have what you have now is you now have the claim that homosexuals have a right to in vitro fertilization. They rent women. They have insemination via very, odd practices. The woman, in effect, becomes a temporary concubine. She enters into a contract to, carry the baby, and then under contract, she turns the baby over. Well, if you stop for a second, you don't pretend you're a Christian or anything like that at all. To have a contract for a human being and turning them over,
right,
Where did we have that in American history before?
Right. Oh, yeah.
Slavery.
Slavery. Yeah.
You had a contract.
Yeah.
You had a contract. Hey, I have a contract. This woman, I'm impregnating her. Her property is mine. Well, no, it's not.
Right.
You're not. In other words, we are revivifying slavery because of the stupid Obergefell decision, because homosexuals can't have kids by nature.
And with that, we're going to take a short break again. We're going to come right back with Delegate Bob Marshall for the last segment. And don't go anywhere. It's only going to get better. Thanks.
Think back to the last time you felt healthy and energized. The best times of our lives occur when we're at the peak of our health, sleeping better, full of energy and focus. We know that fades with age, and you might be feeling the effects of aging as low energy and poor sleep. But it doesn't have to be that way. There haven't been any nutrition systems designed to rejuvenate our bodies as we get older until now. Healthy Cell Pro is the only multi-nutrient system that impacts the building block of your body, the cell. Created by anti-aging expert and Nobel Prize nominee, Dr. Vincent Giampapa, award-winning Healthy Cell Pro cuts through the complexity of nutrition supplements by simply giving you the purest ingredients, filling dietary gaps to nourish your cells and enhance your quality of life for optimal performance. Visit healthycell.com and use code OUTLOUD for an exclusive discount, or call 844-869-9958.
I would like you to meet Dr. Ron Martinelli, forensic criminologist, police expert, and weekly columnist on America Out Loud. Dr. Martinelli, from a law enforcement perspective, what's the biggest change we've seen in policing today?
More connection with the community. There are good changes and not so good changes. Our crime rate in the United States has gone up, and the motivation of officers, because of what we refer to as the Ferguson effect, have caused officers not to be as proactive in looking for danger signs of criminal activity as before. A lot of that has become political. And so it's sort of a symbiotic relationship. When you disincentive officers, they're not out there proactively looking for the criminals like they were before because they're afraid of getting into trouble.
As a prolific author and regular contributor on America Out Loud, how can you use your voice to change the narrative in the public sphere?
Well, I always say that the truth will set you free, and without truth, there is no justice. And we need to have a unified response. That's the only way that we're going to keep all of us safe out there.
We're excited you're here, and we hope you'll share with your friends, family, and associates. You can get our apps on Android or Apple. We stream 24/7. Welcome to the new era in communications, America Out Loud Talk Radio.
All right, you're back with Terry Beatley and Delegate Bob Marshall. We're talking about his new book and what's happened to the Republic. So the new book's called Reclaiming the Republic. We have 188,000 precincts across America. How many of those precincts are managed by Christians? People who understand what's at risk if we lose our country, to the far left, whatever you want to call them. Progressives is another word for communists, is another word for Marxists. Call it whatever you want. But it means death, destruction, really barrenness for America. So, Bob, what I wanted to swing over to is explain first what is the 17th Amendment, and then we're going to dig into what have been the net effects of the 17th Amendment. So what was it, and what year did that happen?
Okay, well, this was like about 1917,
Okay.
16, something like that.
Early 1900s.
I didn't write about the 17th Amendment, but I know about it, and I know why we have it. The original Constitution had state legislatures picking the United States senators. Now, this was in part because the states were kind of structurally stronger than they are at present. You didn't have, $50 or $100 million campaigns. You didn't have people from across the country spending campaign money, from people from a business in California spending money in an election race in New York or Maine or New Hampshire,
Right. Yep.
because the state legislature was the one that picked them, and you couldn't make a campaign donation to a state legislator to pick a federal senator for the state. It just structurally it wasn't a possibility. But what happened was fights in the state legislatures at time as to who they're going to pick, and you had to have both the House and the Senate of the state legislature pick it. The only exception to that is Nebraska, which is what's called a unicameral legislature. There's only senators. There's only one legislative body in New Hampshire. Everybody else has got two. We in Virginia is the House of Delegates, and there's a state senate. But the senators were not being picked in some places in a timely fashion. And so this gave an excuse or opportunity, and it was the progressives, they called themselves progressives, Robert LaFollette from Wisconsin and so on, to say we need the direct election of senators. Well, the direct election of senators changed the structure, federal structure, so that the states lost some kind of influence, and then national lobbying groups replaced that influence with the ability to make campaign contributions all across the United States for people for which they had no otherwise a connection. So that restructured the United States government and made it more national instead of more restrained. And again, it took the influence from the people within the state and it threw it outside the state to these interests that are criticized so often right now. And then right now you've got efforts to completely say no money in politics at all, or no private money. So that's, in other words, this is another bad solution for a previous bad solution.
Well,
That's
kind
of like how that happened.
Well, I was going to say, it goes to prove that our founding fathers, they knew best. They knew why, that the U.S. senators needed to be accountable as closely as possible to the people of the state. So therefore, the best way is let the state government representatives, the elected officials, choose them. It's just such a shame because, can you imagine how things would be so different? Just look at our own state in Virginia. Senator Kane, Senator Warner, if they knew that they were really responsible to the people back in Richmond, the senators and what would be the House of Delegates would not choose them?
House of Delegates would vote for them, and then the state Senate would vote for them.
Oh my gosh, everything would be
and
so
as a matter
different.
Of fact,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
There were people, right, in actually that was like 1912, maybe that was it. Or 1913, because Carl Hayden was a senator from Arizona, the first one that was picked as an elected senator. But I think prior to that, he was an appointed senator, and that was also why budget bills, the appropriations bills, started in the House and not the Senate, because the Senate was appointed and the House was directly elected. So this Constitution was meticulously thought out by persons of prudence and experience and judgment, with the whole history of the learning of centuries behind them. And the cure, direct election of senators, may have been worse than the disease when the state legislature screwed up and didn't pick the senators on time. Mm-hmm. So, watch what you ask for. These things are not well thought out all the time.
Right. Okay, well, one of the points you make in your book is how every American needs to understand how things work in order to work effectively for change. Basically, it's Civics 101. Americans need to understand how it's supposed to work. So here's my question. What levels of government do you think can a citizen influence? Where can they be most effective? What do you think? This, and for anybody new listening, I was just going to say, Delegate Marshall was a delegate for 26 years, so he knows where people can be most effective. So what do you think there?
You can affect the foreign policy of the United States from your living room. How do you do that? You run a precinct. You run a precinct and get people elected to reflect the values of natural law in their public policy decisions. Let me give you kind of an example here. From the precinct, you pick a member of the school board. You pick a member of the supervisors or the city council. You pick your state delegate. You pick your state senator. You pick the U.S. congressman. You pick your U.S. senator. You pick the president of the United States. There's roughly almost 88,000 of these precincts, or these divisions of the entire United States into this many precincts. These precincts are the bedrock, the ground from which all authority springs. If you start there, you can have an effect in, the middle of Africa, on the other side of the, Ganges River. All these things start in your neighborhood. You may not think about it, but that's what it does, because every level of government is elected from there. Now, let me give you an example why things can be manipulated. So if you don't know something, you can be easily manipulated. And that's why I find it completely disingenuous for Nancy Pelosi to say we need to have 16-year-olds be given the vote.
Yeah.
A Woodrow Wilson poll of 1,000 American citizens about 2 months ago found that only 19% of those 45 or under would pass the citizenship naturalization test.
Really?
Well, if this is less than 1 in 5 of American citizens 45 and under. Didn't these people go to the best colleges and have more opportunities for learning? What happened to it?
Right.
Did it never get pounded into their head, or it slipped out once they were leaving school? The only way back is for people who have these Christian values to understand the natural law, because you're dealing with people, some of whom have faith, some of whom don't have faith. But everybody is subject to the laws of gravity. Everybody is subject to the natural moral order, because you're a human being. So when you have citizens hostile to the natural law, who are ignorant of the Constitution, its due process requirements, they are easily led by demagogues. The only way around that is for you, the person who has the sign of faith, to go and animate the body politic closest to you, namely your precinct. You either do this by walking door to door, or driving if you're in a larger area, or making live phone calls to people and getting people's attention on this. You create the community. And the other side's doing this very well. I mean, in my own race in 2017, my opponent would get more than 100 people a weekend walking. I couldn't do that, in part because too many people thought there's no way that a guy who thinks he's a woman can win. I knew there was a way to have it happen, because Barack Obama won my district twice before that. So this can happen. All he did, he calls himself a she, whatever, is get people to go door to door, smile nicely, give the brochure out, and half the time people don't read it, but the name ID is cemented with the voter. And if you're asked to vote, you're more often likely to vote than if you're not asked to vote. So I had people after the election call me up and say, we didn't know who we were voting for. Why? Because the Democrat operatives simply, swept through their neighborhood and say, here, vote for this person right here.
Wow.
It was done reflexively and without thought. So our side has got to go out, people who understand the natural law, and campaign for candidates who will defend the natural law, even when you're not looking at them. And they'll defend it whether they're in a school board, whether they're on a city council, or a supervisor in a magisterial district, or a state delegate in Richmond. And this so-called Equal Rights Amendment, this is going to come back again next year.
Well, let's pick that apart. Wait a minute, I want to spend some time before we're running out of time on the Equal Rights Amendment. So many women, Bob, are mixed up on this. They think it's actually a good thing for women. It's been defeated, but they're relentless. So I think of what Kate Millett did, years ago. with her plan to destroy America by destroying the patriarchy and spreading, basically it was an attack on the American family, and then using women as pawns to spread Marxism across our country. And it's worked brilliantly. So here's my question. Explain what are the pitfalls of the ERA? What would be the net effect of if it ever did get passed, the Equal Rights Amendment?
There is a radical difference between equality and identity. The ERA was devised to bring about an identity between men and women. But again, that's not the way God created the natural order. But that's what these egalitarians want to push on us. So if you have to treat everybody identically, that means you can make no law for which sex is a determinant of the outcome of the operation of the law, which means right now you've got the Selective Service Act, which is where everybody who's between 18 and 25 signs the selective service, selective service system. You have to sign it. If you don't sign it, you can't get a driver's license, regular private driver's license. You can't get a commercial driver's license. You're not eligible for certain grants the state government gives out. There's a whole bunch of things that happen. If you cannot make a distinction, and right now only males are subject to this. Why? Because only males have been put in frontline ground combat. Now, firing pressing a button on a helicopter to discharge a missile to go about 6 miles away from you is not frontline ground combat. Women can do that, but upper body strength is needed for ground combat, frontline ground combat. Women don't have it. It's not evil. It's not malicious. The Creator's not, biased. He made women different from men, and that should be recognized. But it cannot be recognized if you got this Equal Rights Amendment, because the purpose of it is to have what's called strict scrutiny. What that means is that no distinction between men and women will be allowed to be applied in the adjudication of a statute. So if you have no distinction at all, you can't make a law banning abortion. Why? Because as far as I know, and anybody else knows, only women get pregnant. So you're making a law which depends upon sex for its application. Therefore, that is illegal, unconstitutional under an Equal Rights Amendment. And you could be Mother Teresa or the late Justice Scalia, and if this equal rights thing is part of the Constitution, it's abortion on demand. You must pay tax money for abortion because you can't deny a woman money for an operation based on sex. So, I mean, this is just ghastly what this does. Also, let's say you're a college student and you're with some of the girls and you had too much to drink, or the car reeks with alcohol, and you're pulled over. The sheriff takes you in to the local jail and deposits you into jail full of 3 guys accused of sexual assault. You say, wait a minute, I don't want to do this. Say, sorry, honey, I can't have a practice which makes a distinction based on sex. Tough luck. Mm-hmm. That's what happens. You have no institutional privacy. The so-called right of privacy, which came in this decision of the Supreme Court in 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut, which pretended to establish a constitutional right of privacy. Nobody had ever seen this before. But anyway, it established a right of privacy for the use of birth control in marriage. The ERA people claim you can apply that as a general right of privacy in non-marital situations. No, you can't. The A.E. Dick Howard, who's a constitutional scholar from the University of Virginia, wrote the commentary on the Virginia Constitution, criticized individuals who claimed that you'd have a general right to privacy in an institutional setting like a jail or dormitories in schools or a locker room in a high school or junior high school. And he said, no, you don't. You can't. This is not a one-to-one relationship. Right to use birth control, by married people is not a right to be, free of the gaze if you're a 14-year-old girl from a 16-year-old boy in a locker room.
Well, there you have it, America. America Out Loud. We are shouting louder and louder with Delegate Bob Marshall. The book is Reclaiming the Republic. Delegate Marshall, thank you for being on. Thank you for writing the book. And America, go get the book. We're going to have a link for your book right on our platform on the What If We've Been Wrong.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so it'll be right there. They can click it. And so America, get the book, read it, sit down and read it with your family. That's your action item. If you've got teenagers in your house, sit down, once a week or a couple times a week, read a chapter together, discuss, and then, because if you don't do it, who is? All right, thank you, and we will see you next time.